There are unwritten rules on the streets, but the most sacred one is simple. You never ever touch a Hell's Angels motorcycle. Two desperate thieves thought they had just scored the jackpot with a custom Harley-Davidson. They didn't realize they had just signed their own death warrants, drawing a map straight to their door. The Oakland fog rolled in thick off the bay, carrying with it the scent of salt, decaying kelp, and the faint metallic tang of the nearby shipping yards. Neon signs buzzed and flickered against the damp pavement, casting long, distorted shadows down the narrow alleyway behind the Rusty Anchor, a notorious dive bar sitting on the gritty edge of the industrial district. Tyler Reed and Seth Hopkins were not master criminals. They were opportunists, driven by an escalating debt to a local bookie that had long surpassed their ability to pay. Tyler was the instigator, a man whose ambition always dangerously outpaced his intelligence. Seth was the anxious shadow, roped in by a misplaced sense of loyalty and a desperate need for a quick payday. For 3 hours they had been freezing in the cab of a stolen, rusted-out Ford Econoline van, watching the bikes come and go from the bar's back lot. Most of the motorcycles were standard cruisers, but one stood out, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a solitary street lamp. It was a masterpiece of machinery, a custom 1948 Harley-Davidson FL Panhead. The paint was a deep, impossible shade of midnight crimson, so dark it almost looked black until the light caught the subtle metallic flaking. The chrome was flawless, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the grim surroundings with startling clarity. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mechanical work of art, a piece of rolling history that radiated an aura of raw, untamed power. Tyler tapped the steering wheel, his eyes wide with a hungry, desperate gleam. "That's the one, Seth. Look at it. That's custom vintage. We get that to the chop shop in San Leandro. We can clear our debt and have enough left over to disappear to Mexico for a year." Seth shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, his stomach twisting into tight, cold knots. He wiped the condensation off the window, peering at the bike. "I don't know, man. Look at the way it's parked. It's sitting right by the back door, completely separated from the rest. It's like it owns the pavement. You don't park a bike like that unless you're someone who doesn't worry about it getting stolen. And look at the front fender." Tyler squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. There, barely visible, was a small, meticulously hand-painted decal, a tiny winged death head, accompanied by the numbers 81. "It's just a sticker," Tyler dismissed, his greed entirely overriding his survival instincts. "Some wannabe trying to look tough. Nobody leaves a real club bike out here unguarded." What Tyler didn't know, what his ignorance blinded him to, was that the panhead belonged to Mike Iron Rossi. Rossi wasn't a wannabe. He was a fully patched 30-year veteran of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Oakland chapter. The bike was a legend in its own right, its engine originally rebuilt in the late 1970s by a mechanic who had worked side by side with Ralph "Sonny" Barger during the club's most turbulent years. Rossi had poured his blood, his sweat, and tens of thousands of dollars into maintaining the machine. It was practically an extension of his own physical body. "Get the bolt cutters and the ramp," Tyler ordered, shoving open the van door. The cold, damp air hit them instantly. "We move fast. 30 seconds, we load it, and we are ghosts." They slipped through the shadows. The sheer weight of the panhead was staggering. It wasn't built with lightweight modern plastics. It was heavy American steel. Tyler bypassed the ignition with a practiced, brutal efficiency, using a specialized hardened steel pick to snap the locking mechanism. Seth, sweating profusely despite the freezing temperature, wrestled the heavy metal ramp to the back of the Econoline. Every metallic clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet alley. Adrenaline coursed through their veins, deafening them to everything but the sound of their own ragged breathing. With a synchronized, agonizing heave, they pushed the heavy Harley up the ramp and into the dark cavern of the van. Tyler slammed the doors shut, the metallic thud sealing their fate. They scrambled into the front seats, the Ford's engine sputtering to life before squealing out of the alley, vanishing into the Oakland fog. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel-reinforced back door of the Rusty Anchor swung open. Mike Rossi stepped out, a lit cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. He was a massive man, his leather cut worn and weathered, bearing the iconic top and bottom rockers that commanded immediate, absolute respect on the streets of California. He didn't yell, he didn't curse. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting and he saw the empty space where his panhead had been resting, a terrifying absolute silence fell over him. The cigarette dropped from his lips, sizzling as it hit a puddle. The veins in his thick neck bulged, his jaw clenching so hard it looked as though his teeth might shatter. Rossi didn't reach for his phone to dial 911. The police had no jurisdiction in his world. Instead, he pulled out an encrypted burner phone, scrolling down to a single contact labeled simply Frank. "Yeah?" A deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. It was Frank Castellano, the chapter president. "Someone took the panhead," Rossi said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and devoid of any human emotion. It was the voice of a man who had just decided exactly how someone else was going to die. There was a heavy pause on the line. Frank knew the history of that bike. He knew what it meant to Rossi. Where? Behind the Anchor. 10 minutes ago. I'll make the call," Frank replied smoothly. "Get to the Clubhouse." Rossi pocketed the phone. He looked down at the tire tracks left by the van in the damp mud of the alley. A grim, terrifying smile crept across his scarred face. The fools who took it thought they had gotten away clean. They had no idea what they had just awakened. The Oakland Hells Angels Clubhouse was a fortress, situated behind high cinder-block walls topped with razor wire and heavy steel gates. It was a sanctuary where the laws of the outside world ceased to exist. By the time Mike Rossi arrived in a borrowed truck, the atmosphere inside was electric. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of gun oil, and a palpable, simmering rage. 30 fully patched members were already pulling on their leather cuts, checking the magazines of their heavy-caliber sidearms, and lacing up heavy steel-toed boots. They moved with a practiced, military precision. There was no chaotic shouting, only the low, grim murmurs of men preparing for a hunt. Frank Castellano stood at the head of a heavy oak table, a glowing laptop open in front of him. Frank was a mountain of a man, intelligent, utterly ruthless, and fiercely protective of his brothers. As Rossi walked in, Frank turned the laptop screen toward him. "They aren't very smart, Mike," Frank said, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. On the screen, a small red dot was blinking steadily on a digital map of the Bay Area. It was moving south, creeping down the Interstate 88 order toward San Leandro. When Rossi had rebuilt the panhead, he knew its value. Both monetary and sentimental made it a prime target. But Rossi was not a man who left things to chance. Hidden deep within the primary chain case housing, wired directly into the motorcycle's intricate electrical system, was a military-grade GPS transponder. It wasn't a cheap commercial tracker that could be easily scanned or disabled. It was designed to run silently, drawing minimal power and broadcasting a continuous, encrypted signal. The thieves had thought they were stealing a ghost. Instead, they had swallowed a beacon. "They're heading toward the warehouse district on the edge of San Leandro," Frank noted, tracing the red dot's path with a thick, calloused finger. "There's an old industrial park there, lots of abandoned sheet metal factories and chop shops." Rossi stared at the blinking red dot. "I want the point. It's my bike." Frank nodded slowly. "We ride tight. We secure the perimeter. Nobody gets in, and nobody leaves until we have the bike and the men who took it. Outside, the roar of 30 heavy V-twin engines firing up simultaneously shook the very foundations of the clubhouse. It was a sound that commanded fear, a deep, thunderous vibration that resonated in the chest. As the heavy steel gates swung open, the pack poured out onto the midnight streets of Oakland like a mechanized cavalry. Rossi at the spearhead, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, a single Farland purpose driving him forward. Meanwhile, inside a cavernous, drafty warehouse in San Leandro, Tyler and Seth were completely oblivious to the storm bearing down on them. The interior of the chop shop smelled sharply of acetylene gas, stale beer, and engine degreaser. Stripped car chassis and motorcycle frames hung from heavy chains like metallic carcasses in the slaughterhouse. They had just unstrapped the panhead and rolled it onto the greasy concrete floor. Stepping out from a makeshift office enclosed by grimy plexiglass was Arthur Penhaligon, a notoriously shady fence and mechanic known in the underworld simply as Greasy Artie. Artie wiped his oil-stained hands on a filthy rag as he walked over, his eyes narrowing as he took in the gleaming crimson motorcycle. "What the hell is this, Tyler?" Artie asked, his voice tight. He didn't look impressed. He looked instantly nervous. "It's a payday, Artie," Tyler bragged, leaning casually against the stolen van. "Flawless vintage panhead, not a scratch on it. You strip this down, sell the parts to your overseas buyers. We're talking high five figures." "Easy." Artie didn't respond. He stepped closer to the bike, circling it slowly. He noticed the flawless chrome, the customized extended forks, the immaculate leather of the solo seat. Then he knelt down. He leaned in close to the primary cover. There, etched with impossible precision into the solid metal, was the unmistakable winged death head insignia of the Hells Angels. He stood up, his gaze shifting to the custom-painted 81 on the front fender, a detail his trained eye recognized immediately as club colors. All the blood instantly drained from Artie's face. He stumbled backward, dropping his oily rag. He looked at Tyler not with greed, but with absolute, unadulterated horror. "You stupid, arrogant son of a bitch," Artie whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. Tyler frowned, his cocky demeanor faltering for a fraction of a second. "What's your problem, Artie? It's just a bike." "It's not just a bike, you brain-dead moron," Artie suddenly screamed, panic entirely taking over. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench, holding it up as if to defend himself from Tyler. "Do you have any idea whose property this is? Do you know what that insignia means? You didn't steal from some rich yuppie. You stole a patched member's ride. A Hell's Angel." Seth, who had been quietly standing by the van, felt his knees go weak. "Tyler, what did you do?" "They'll kill me just for being in the same room as this thing," Artie babbled, backing toward the rear exit of the warehouse. "I'm not touching it. I'm not buying it. Get it out of my shop. Get out," Tyler scoffed, trying to mask the sudden, icy dread creeping up his spine. "Calm down, Artie. Nobody saw us. We were in and out in 30 seconds. They don't know who we are. They don't know where we went. They don't need to know who you are," Artie yelled, his hand frantically fumbling for the lock on the back door. "They find out everything. You brought a curse into my shop." Before Artie could turn the deadbolt, a strange sensation washed over the warehouse. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration. The loose corrugated tin of the warehouse roof began to rattle softly. The heavy chains hanging from the ceiling swayed by a fraction of an inch. Seth froze, his eyes darting toward the heavy rolling steel door at the front of the shop. "Tyler, do you feel that?" The vibration grew, traveling up through the soles of their shoes. Then the sound reached them, It wasn't the sound of police sirens or a passing truck. It was a low, guttural, synchronized mechanical roar. The thunder of 30 customized Harley-Davidson engines echoing off the concrete walls of the industrial park, growing louder and closer by the second. Tyler's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the panhead, then at the front door. The roaring stopped directly outside. A moment later, the blinding beams of high-intensity motorcycle headlights pierced through the cracks in the corrugated steel door, casting long, terrifying shadows across the chop shop floor. They hadn't just stolen a motorcycle. They had led the wolves directly to their den. The thunderous roar of the 30 heavy V-twin engines abruptly ceased, cut off in perfect, terrifying unison. The sudden silence that followed was infinitely worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sharp pings of cooling exhaust pipes and the low, rhythmic thud of heavy leather boots hitting the wet pavement outside. Inside the chop shop, the air grew incredibly stale. Tyler's hand hovered near his waistband, where he kept a cheap, unregistered .38 caliber revolver. His fingers were slick with cold sweat. Seth was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the cavernous room, searching for a place to hide among the stripped chassis and oily engine blocks. There was nowhere. "They're out there," Artie whispered, his voice cracking as he backed away from the pristine crimson panhead. "They surrounded the building. I told you, Tyler. I told you." Before Tyler could utter a word of his usual false bravado, a shower of brilliant white-hot sparks erupted from the bottom of the heavy rolling steel door. The unmistakable high-pitched screech of an angle grinder tearing through hardened steel echoed through the warehouse. The thieves watched in paralyzed horror as the heavy-duty padlock was obliterated in a matter of seconds. The chains rattled and the massive corrugated door was violently hauled upward. The thick, damp Oakland fog rolled over the concrete threshold, illuminated by the blinding glare of a dozen high-intensity motorcycle headlights. Standing in the swirling mist were the silhouettes of the Oakland Hells Angels. They didn't rush in like a SWAT team. They moved with a slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying calm. They fanned out, securing the perimeter of the interior with military precision, their heavy boots crunching over discarded bolts and broken glass. At the center of the formation stood Mike Rossi, his face a mask of cold, uncompromising fury, and Frank Castellano radiating the undeniable authority of a chapter president. Artie, completely driven by blind panic, spun on his heels and sprinted for the rear exit. He unlatched the deadbolt and threw the heavy metal door open, intending to disappear into the labyrinth of the industrial park. Instead, he slammed face first into what felt like a solid brick wall. It was a biker named Hutch, a hulking enforcer with a scarred face and arms the size of tree trunks. Hutch didn't say a word. He simply grabbed Artie by the collar of his greasy overalls and hurled him effortlessly back into the center of the shop. Artie slid across the oily floor, coming to a halt near the front tire of the stolen panhead. Rossi stepped forward, his eyes locked entirely on his motorcycle. He walked past Tyler and Seth as if they were nothing more than ghosts, irrelevant specks of dust in his periphery. He circled the bike, his massive hands gently running over the flawless chrome, checking the leather seat, inspecting the primary cover where the GPS was hidden, finding not a single scratch. The rigid tension in his broad shoulders relaxed slightly, though the murderous look in his eyes remained. "Bike's clean, Frank," Rossi muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Frank Castellano stepped out from the fog and into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the warehouse. He looked at Tyler and Seth. "You boys have had a very busy night," Frank said, his tone deceptively conversational, though it carried a lethal undercurrent. taking things that don't belong to you, disrespecting a patched member, bringing heat into my city. Tyler, backed into a corner and losing his grip on reality, made the worst calculation of his entire life. With a trembling hand, he drew the cheap .38 revolver from his waistband, pointing it shakily toward Frank's massive chest. "Stay back," Tyler shouted, his voice shrill and echoing off the tin roof. "I'll shoot. I swear to God, I'll put a bullet right in you." The reaction in the room was not what Tyler expected. Nobody ducked. Nobody scrambled for cover. A few of the angels chuckled a dark, humorless sound. Frank didn't even break his stride. He continued walking slowly toward Tyler, his eyes locked onto the terrified thief's face. "You pull a weapon on me, son. You better be ready to use it," Frank said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "But let me explain the mathematics of your situation. You fire that toy and maybe, just maybe, you hit me. But before my body even hits this greasy floor, my brothers are going to take you apart. Slowly. They won't use bullets. Bullets are too fast. They will use the tools in this shop. And when they are finished, there won't be enough of you left to fill a shoebox." Tyler's hand shook so violently the gun nearly slipped from his grip. The sheer psychological weight of Frank's presence was crushing him. He looked past Frank to the 30 heavily armed, hardened men blocking every conceivable exit. The realization of his absolute doom finally crashed over him. Suddenly, Seth lunged forward. He didn't attack Frank, he tackled his own partner. Seth slammed into Tyler, knocking the .38 revolver out of his hand. It clattered uselessly across the concrete floor, sliding under a rusted car chassis. "Don't kill us!" Seth screamed, dropping to his knees, his hands clasped together in desperate supplication. "Please, we're just stupid. We owe money. We didn't know whose it was, I swear." Frank stopped, raising a single hand. The room fell perfectly still. He looked down at Seth, the cruel, calculating spark igniting in his dark eyes. The tension hung in the air like a physical weight, thick enough to cut with a knife. The Hells Angels were not known for their mercy, but Frank Castellano was a businessman above all else. "You owe money?" Frank asked quietly, leaning down slightly. "To who?" Seth kept his eyes glued to the scuffed toes of Frank's heavy boots. He knew that one wrong word, one slight hesitation, would result in his immediate execution. The metallic tang of fear coated his tongue. "Ricky Valente," Seth blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in his rush to stay alive. "They call him the Shark. We owe him 40 grand. We were just trying to clear the book. That's why we took the bike. We were desperate." A subtle shift occurred in the room. Frank slowly straightened up, exchanging a very deliberate, meaningful look with Rossi. The other angels in the room remained perfectly still, but the atmosphere changed from immediate violence to cold calculation. Ricky Valente was a mid-level, organized crime figure operating out of the East Bay. He ran a highly lucrative, heavily fortified underground casino and sports betting ring. For 6 months, Valente had been aggressively encroaching on territories the club considered their own, skimming profits and stepping on toes. The Angels had been looking for a clean, untraceable way to dismantle Valente's operation without sparking an all-out, highly publicized street war that would draw the FBI's attention. Frank pulled a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket, flipping it open with a sharp clink and lighting a thick cigar. He took a long drag, the cherry glowing fiercely in the dim shop. "Ricky the Shark," Frank mused, blowing a thick cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "He operates out of that reinforced warehouse down by the Oakland docks. Heavy security, cameras, steel doors." "Yes." Seth nodded frantically, seeing a tiny sliver of hope. "But we know the layout. Tyler does the maintenance on his HVAC units. We know the blind spots. We have the access codes for the loading dock doors. We can get you inside. Tyler, still sprawled on the oily concrete, stared at Seth in disbelief. "Seth, you idiot. Valente will skin us alive." "Shut up, Tyler." Seth snapped, his survival instinct completely overriding his fear of the mobster. He looked back up at Frank. "We can give you Valente. The whole operation. You can walk right in. Just, please, let us walk away from this." Frank paced slowly around the kneeling thief. The Angels were not cops, they didn't make plea deals. But they were opportunists. Bloodshed over a recovered motorcycle was satisfying, but taking down a rival operation and seizing a massive illegal cash reserve was extremely profitable. "Here is the reality of your miserable existence," Frank said, his voice cold and authoritative. "You don't walk away. Not tonight. Not ever. You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." Seth's heart plummeted. The brief flash of hope extinguished instantly. "However," Frank continued, stopping directly in front of the two thieves, "I am a reasonable man. You stole from my brother. Your lives are forfeit, but you've offered me something of value. So we are going to make a transaction. You are going to give us the access codes. You are going to draw a map of Valente's security grid. If your information is perfect, and I mean absolutely flawless, we will handle Ricky the Shark." Frank leaned in close, the smell of tobacco and gun oil washing over Seth. "But understand this," Frank whispered dangerously. "If you are lying, if there is a single camera you forgot to mention, if a single alarm goes off that shouldn't, we won't just kill you. We will find everyone you care about, and we will make you watch what we do to them before we finally end you." Seth swallowed hard, tears of pure terror and relief streaming down his face. "It's perfect. I swear. I'll draw it right now." Frank nodded, stepping back. He turned his attention to Artie, who was still cowering by the front tire of the panhead. "As for you, greasy Artie," Frank said. Artie flinched as if he had been struck. "Your shop is now a subsidiary of the Oakland chapter. You keep the doors open. You keep grinding off VIN numbers, but 70% of everything that flows through this garage belongs to the club. You miss a payment, we burn it to the ground with you inside." "Yes, Mr. Castellano." "Yes, whatever you say," Artie stammered, nodding furiously. Rossi swung a heavy, leather-clad leg over his beloved panhead. He turned the ignition, and the massive engine roared to life on the first kick, the deep, guttural thunder filling the warehouse once more. He didn't look back at the thieves. He simply rolled the bike forward, parting the sea of leather-clad men, and rode out into the damp Oakland night. Frank gestured to Hutch. "Get a pen and paper, get the codes, and take their van. It's collateral." As the Hells Angels slowly filed out of the chop shop, leaving only Hutch behind to collect the intelligence, Tyler and Seth remained on the floor. They had survived the night, but the crushing reality of their new existence settled heavily upon them. They had traded a $40,000 debt to a local mobster for a lifelong blood debt to the most dangerous motorcycle club in the world. They hadn't escaped. They had simply chained themselves to a much larger, much deadlier monster. That's the chilling reality of crossing paths with the Hells Angels. The streets have rules, and breaking them comes with a price you can never fully pay. These thieves survived the night, but they traded one nightmare for a lifetime of servitude to the club. If you loved this intense, real-life underworld story, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more gripping true crime tales.